hopefully the topics have brought you in for us this evening. If you ever have any ideas of other programming, I would welcome that. If you know who speaks on a topic, would be even more appreciated. Tentatively, next month is Hale Farm and Village. She was supposed to let me know, but she hasn't let me know yet. So that's unfortunate, but tentatively. But I'll let you know that through the newspaper and social media and our website about that. But in May, I will give you a few of the other future ones. Is the Wicked Women of Ohio, presented by Jane Ann Tresillo, who's the author of the Wicked Women of Ohio books. In June, we will have a presentation about pre-Civil War women's history in Columbiana County, presented by Laura Henskin, who's the author of Deep Cover Cleveland, 99 Little Things to Know About Northeast Ohio. And in July, we have a presentation about the Negro Baseball League, who's presented by Leslie Heppy, Associate Chair and Associate Professor of History Department at Kent State University. So that's a few of the upcoming programs that we have. So I hope you enjoy some of those. However, tonight we have speaker is Gary Cornell, who is the author of Dark Days, Tales of Disaster, Murder, Mysteries in East Liverpool area. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to be with us last fall, so I scheduled him right away for the beginning of this year, so we didn't have to wait too much longer. A little bit about Gary. He's lived in East Liverpool his entire life and is retired from the East Liverpool Fire Department and had advanced to the rank of an assistant fire chief there. As a lifelong resident of he has a passion for history and has led him to become the unofficial, historian of the fire department, as well as his involvement with disasters during his career has served as an inspiration in writing some of his books, for which obviously he will speak about tonight, taking us through a few of the true stories of crime disasters that occurred in the East Liverpool and surrounding areas. So at this point, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Gary to entertain us for a little bit.
I want to thank everybody for coming, and I want to thank you for having me. I know I'm not from Salem, and I'm from way down south in East Liverpool, and perhaps you won't be interested in what goes on down there, but perhaps you will. As Kevin said, I'm retired from the East Liverpool Fire Department. I've lived in East Liverpool all my life. I started there in 1975 on the fire department, and I retired in 2007. And by that occupation, I was involved in a number of fires and some disastrous type things, and I've always had a kind of a thought towards that. It was interesting to me. And in 1984, I began to write a book. And it was going to be on the history of the East Liverpool Fire Department. And I wanted to have it done by 1996, because in 1996, the East Liverpool Fire Department would be 100 years old as a professional full-time department. So I worked really hard on getting the book ready for 1996, and then when 1996 came, I found out that I couldn't afford to put it out and publish it, because those days you still had to set the type and everything, and it was several $1,000s, and I didn't have several $1,000s to put in the book, so it sat on the shelf. And I used it to talk about, and people would come and ask questions, and I would refer back to the book. Well, after I retired, and I didn't have anything to do, and I was sitting there toward Christmas time, and my son bought me a set of books for Christmas about disasters and murders and mayhem having to do in Cleveland, because he knows I like to read about those things. So as I was reading them, I thought, I could write a book like this. I know a lot of stories from East Liverpool. Why don't I write this book? And my son said, well, why don't you write the book? So I set about to write the book. And in 2015, I published this book here, Dark Days. It was my first book. And it is a Tales of Disaster, Murder, Mystery from the East Liverpool area. And I've been very blessed because it's sold much greater than I thought it would. And people like it. And people said, why don't you write another one? Well, I said, well, why don't I publish the one about the fire department that's been sitting on the shelf for 20 years? So I published this. This is the book that I did and I set on the shelf. But they still said, why don't you write another one like Dark Days? People like the stories. So I began writing a third book. And the title of it is Unearthed. And it's coming out in the fall. And in that book, I kind of branched out a little bit. The first book, Dark Days, covers mostly things that happened around East Liverpool and Wellsville, the lower end of the county. Unearthed has some stories from there, but it also has some stories from up further north in the county. I've touched on a couple things in Salem, some things in Latonia, things around Columbiana, Lisbon, all those things. So I was thinking when I was asked to come and speak, what should I speak on? And that's always a topic I have to think about. So I decided that I would tell you a story that's coming up in my new book. And I call this story, I thought of a really catchy title. The title is Caveat Lector, and that's Latin, and it means let the reader beware. Okay? This story, as I started out in my first book, Dark Days, and in my book, Unearthed, which is coming out, I tried to get the absolute facts. I worked really hard to get the absolute fact of a story. I don't like to do old wives' tales and urban legends and things of that sort. But in the research for that book, I ran across this story. And it intrigued me so much that I felt that I had to write about it. But as I say here in the beginning, this story is full of truth, half-truth, mystery, and perhaps complete fabrication. So take it for what it's worth. Okay. The story begins in April of 1891. The Buckeye State newspaper from Lisbon, the reporter there published a story in the paper, and he said that out by Hanoverton, some people were tearing down an old log house. And when they were removing the logs, they found a neatly wrapped package between the logs. And they opened it up, and there was $7,000 in gold coins in this package. The reporter said, we didn't see the package. It might be a hoax, but they say it's true. So I thought, when I read that in the newspaper, because I was going through old newspapers looking for stories, I thought, wow, there's $7,000 in gold in this between. So the following week, because this is a weekly newspaper, the following week I looked at the Buckeye State to see what they had to say about it. And the reporter said, it's true. It was a false story, a complete hoax. An unadulterated campaign lie. Well, that intrigued me. I thought, a campaign lie? Politics? Is that what's the $7,000 got to do with politics? Well, there was an election going on at that time. And I perused the paper and looked, and the only thing I could see that had anything to do with Hanover Township was that there was a man by the name of Fred Conser who was running for sheriff. And I thought, wonder if this story had something to do with him, maybe a robbery or who knows what. I don't know. He didn't win. I don't know whether the story helped him, hurt him, whatever, but he didn't win. So I thought, well, that story didn't go anywhere. So I was kind of looking through the rest of the paper, and I see this letter to the editor. And it's from a man who says, well, they called him a well-respected old resident, but they didn't give his name, and they said he wants to get something off his chest. And he began to tell a story, and this is the story. There was a man by the name of David Miller who lived on a farm a few miles outside of Hanoverton. And as the story goes, David Miller was sort of a recluse. He was also enormous. They said he was a gigantic man, heavy, perhaps the biggest, fattest man in Columbiana County. And one day a neighbor came to a house to talk to him about something and found the door open. And when he opened up the door, he found David Miller hanging from the rafters of his house. Well, shocked, he went into town and told the story, and concerned citizens came out, and they took his body and they buried him in an extra large sized coffin on his farm. And they went back into town. Well, in those days in Hanoverton, there was a doctor who had medical students apprenticing under him. That was the practice in those days. This is 50 years, I forgot to tell you, 50 years previous to 1891, so the 1840s. They didn't have many colleges for you to go be a doctor, so what you did, like many trades, you found a doctor who was practicing, and if he would take you on as a student, he would train you. So there was this doctor in Hanoverton, and he had a group of students training under him. And one day they were all in a tavern, and they were talking about this recent suicide of this man, David Miller. And they said, you know, we got to dig him up. And we use him as a medical specimen. We need a body to practice on, to dissect, to understand how things work in the human body. Well, that was scandalous. And as they were sitting around their table discussing this plan, somebody overheard them. And that person rushed right out to his friends, and he said, I just heard that there's these ghouls are going to dig up poor David Miller. We've got to do something about it. And they all got together and they began to talk, and they were like, well, what do we do? And one guy said, well, we need to put a guard out there to guard the grave. And another one said, well, that ain't going to be me. I'm not sitting out there on a grave all night. And they're like, well, we get to have somebody. And the conversation went back and forth and back and forth, until finally they looked over in the corner, and like your Kevin, whatever he is, sitting over there was a blacksmith by the name of Joseph Walker. And Joseph Walker was a big, stout man. You would expect a blacksmith. And he was sitting there very quietly. And they all started to look at him, to eye him. And finally he said, well, okay, I guess I can do it. And they're like, oh, yes, yes. They all shook his hand, and they were all happy. And they said, you be the man, and you only have to do it for a week or so, because after that, Mother Nature will take its course, and they probably won't want him anyway. So that night, got dark. Joe Walker went out to the grave site, and he sat there all night, alone. Not a sound, except for the animals that prowl the night. The owls screeching, the rustling of bushes, and everything that he made a noise, he probably jumped and was a little. But came daylight, and nobody had shown up to dig up David Miller. So he went back to his blacksmith shop, and I'm sure he was working at his forge and thinking to himself, what a fool I am. This is ridiculous. Why am I sitting out here all night long in the dark and cold? It's March. You know, why am I doing this? But the next night, true to his duty, he was back at the gravesite. And as the night wore on, he was sitting there, leaned up against a tree, and he was almost dozing when he heard a noise. And it startled him, and he looked, and he couldn't see what was coming, but he could hear the clip-clop of horses' hoofs drawing closer in the dark. And he squinted to see, and he still couldn't make anything out. But he began to get a little nervous, so he got up and kind of stepped back into the bushes a little bit. And pretty soon you could hear the squeak of the wagon wheels. And after a few moments, here came this horse and wagon, about 4 or 5 men on it. And they pulled up alongside the freshly dug grave of David Miller. And they got out. One of them lit a lantern, and the glow from the lantern was dim, but it kind of illuminated the scene as worthy of every horror film we've all seen. And a couple guys got shovels out, and they began to dig. Joe Walker is standing there in the bushes thinking, what do I do? What do I do? They're here. They're digging him up. He screwed up his courage and cleared his throat, and he stepped out into the light, and nobody noticed him at first. And then he roared, "Stop what you're doing in the name of God!" Well, the guys, they jumped up off their, about that high in the air, and they were shocked. Well, the one guy who was digging, out of reflexes or fear or whatever, swung his shovel out, and he struck Joe Walker with the shovel and knocked him onto the ground. Joe Walker, when he hit the ground, he was fearful now for his life. You know, they were attacking him. He had a pistol. He pulled the pistol out and he fired. The light from the pistol, the fire shot illuminated the scene, and the one guy who had hit him with a shovel grabbed his stomach, let out a moan, and fell to the ground. His friends all gathered him up quickly and threw him in the wagon, and they jumped in the wagon and hit the horses, and with a whip, and away they went, leaving Joe Walker sitting on the ground in the dim light of the lantern. A few moments went by, and he finally got his senses back, and he jumped up and he hurried back into Hanoverton, and he gathered his friends up, and he said, "They came and they attacked me, and I shot one of them, and I think I killed him." And his friend says, No, you probably didn't kill him. You don't know what happened. You're just excited." He says, "No, I shot him, and he fell down." And it's like, "Just stay quiet. Everything will be good." So Joe Walker said, "Okay." So the next morning, the group of men got together and they said, "Well, we got to still protect the grave, but now nobody's going to go back out there. Nobody's going to go back after what happened to poor Joe." So they went out, a group, several men, and they dug a new grave, 10 feet square, 8 feet deep. In the bottom of the grave, they dug a normal-sized grave, and they dug Miller's body up, his oversized casket, and they put it down into the grave in the bottom of the pit, covered it over. And they cut logs 10 feet long and laid down in on top of it, crisscross. And then they covered it over, so that anybody trying to dig it up would have a terrible time with all the logs and everything. The newspaper said it was probably the most unique tomb in Columbiana County. And then everybody zipped their lip. A week or two goes by, and a stranger comes to Hanoverton from Wellsville, passing through. And he stops at the tavern, which was the thing that travelers did, and went and get something to eat, socialize. And of course, people from Hanoverton, in 1844, they didn't get out much, so they go and they want to talk to him. What's going on down in Wellsville? That's a strange place. Who knows what? 25 miles away. Nobody's ever been there. And he begins to tell them the story. Oh, well, this happened, that happened. And oh, by the way, there was a young doctor who just up and died. Nobody actually knows what happened to him. He just turned up dead. And they all looked at each other like, uh-oh. Maybe. 50 years go by. And this man, now the old, well-respected citizen who wants to get this story off his chest, writes to the newspaper. Because the log house that was being torn down, that the gold was supposed to be in, was David Miller's house. And that spurred his desire to get this story out. So the newspaper printed it, and I wrote it all down. Now another week goes by, and the next edition of the newspaper. The next edition of the newspaper says, I was a young, another letter to the editor by another person, says, I was a young boy who lived on the farm next to David Miller. And I want to correct some things that was said in the letter last week. First of all, David Miller wasn't a recluse. He lived on the farm with his two sisters and one of their husbands. Secondly, he didn't hang himself in the house. He hung himself on a fence out in the yard, out in the field. He tied a rope to the fence and around his neck, and then he just let himself hang there against the fence, and his enormous weight choked himself to death. He could have saved himself any time he wanted by just pushing away, but he didn't. And he said, they had an inquest. They actually did an autopsy to see whether or not he was crazy, because he killed himself. And my father drove him to the graveside in his farm in my father's wagon. And I don't remember anything about any grave. But I do remember something about somebody being shot. And there was quite a stir at the time. But that's all I can remember. So that caused me to start looking deeper. And I find that in March 22nd of 1844, David Miller hung himself on a fence because he owed money and he couldn't pay it back. And it didn't say anything about a grave. And it didn't say anything about gold. And it didn't say anything about anybody being shot. I looked up to see if I could find Joe Walker. the blacksmith. And I couldn't find him either. But that doesn't change a good story. So, as I said before, this story is full of truths, half-truths, perhaps complete and utter fabrication. Let the reader beware. Any questions anybody would like to ask?
What's the end of the story?
What's the end of the story?
Well, David Miller did kill himself. That's in the newspaper. I don't know anything about a grave. I don't know anything about somebody trying to dig him up. But it made a good story. And it was a break from what I normally like to do. But I enjoyed the story so much I thought I needed to write it. But I wanted to be sure that people knew. Take it for what it's worth. It's strictly a story. Yes, ma'am.
Did you bring any books with you to sell?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
All right. Both
Yes.
of those books?
Yes, I did.
I lived in East Liverpool for 35 years.
Okay.
I originally was born in Wellsville.
All right.
That's where I was born. And I recognized your name
Okay.
as a fireman. I lived up in Pleasant Heights.
Well, so did I. That's where I grew up.
It is. Did you know Jill Salisbury?
Yeah, Salisbury's, yeah.
Well, her mom just passed away
Okay.
yesterday, in fact.
Oh, that's too bad.
So, you probably went to school with Jill.
We weren't the same age, but yes.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember they had a Scotty dog that had 3 legs.
And I'm sure you'll recognize this name. Joe Wells Thirst passed away yesterday. And for any of you that don't know who Joe Wells is, he was the owner, president, and CEO of Homer Rockman China Company.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us anything about the other sources you use besides the newspaper?
Well, I start out with the newspapers because that's where stories that I write about usually happen. But if I could find other sources, like any fire story that I have, and being a fireman, I include a number of stories about fires. I use the records of the fire department. You know, I'm the unofficial historian. I named myself that because I'm the one they always ask. If they didn't give me the title, I took it. But I use the fire department records. I also use any government records of anything as far as like census records, court records. Some murders that I've done, I've actually read the court documents, things of that sort. Anything I can find to add to it. And I keep a pretty detailed account of all my sources at the end of my books for each story. You know, I list them all so that if you're really interested, you can probably go find them. And hopefully I haven't made too many mistakes. So. Yes.
The story you told us there, do you think that was the beginning of fake news?
Possibly. Yes, ma'am.
I got 2 questions. What's the biggest fire that you can remember in East Liverpool, and has downtown East Liverpool ever been flooded?
No, well, the biggest fire in my time or in history?
In history.
Well, the biggest fire that occurred in East Liverpool in history was the what I call the Great Diamond Fire of 1905. It burnt basically from Market Street, 5th Street, a whole quarter block.
Really?
And it extended beyond that block. So I think all told there was 11 buildings burnt down and probably another 5 or 6 that were severely damaged. In those days, the dollar figure of loss for that fire was put at about $900,000 in 1905. In today's money, that would be about $10 or $12 million. that was the biggest fire in the business district. The most expensive fire that ever happened in East Liverpool was the Modern Glass Company fire in 1994, which I was part of. It was loss of $10 million in that one factory. So, you know, the largest loss of life to ever occur in East Liverpool in a fire was the Stewart Feed Mill in 1881. 8 persons lost their life in that fire. So it depends on how you want to look at the fires as to, you know, how big they are, how much they cost, or how many people lost their life. So, yes, ma'am.
Somebody asked a question about, was there ever a flood in East Liverpool?
Oh, in a flood?
Every year, huh?
Lots of floods, but not downtown.
Oh, okay.
The downtown section sits up on a hill. If it flooded up there, Noah would have to build another boat. But the lower end parts of downtown East Liverpool flood quite often, really. Not nearly as much now as they used to.
River Road.
River Road, Jethro Hollow, Little England, those neighborhoods
I know all those areas.
flood out pretty regularly. I have hauled people out numerous times in my career, yeah.
Do you have a favorite story from your book on the East Liverpool mayhem that might interest you?
Well, probably the murder that took place in East Liverpool that is on the minds of most people occurred in 1973, and that was the Tweed Morris murder, where a man by the name of Tweed, who owned a wholesale furniture store, was killed along with a young woman and her 5-year-old daughter, and the young woman was pregnant as well. And somebody bludgeoned them to death in the store in the middle of the day, like between noon and 1 o'clock. And it's unsolved. And I remember that as a young man, and I wasn't on the fire department for 2 more years, but I remember that. In fact, I knew the husband of the man whose wife and daughter was killed. I worked with him for a time. That murder has always held a urban legend kind of thought in East Liverpool area, you know, the Tweed killing, as it's known. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but I will, I guess. I talked to a police officer the other day who said that they think they found out who actually did it, and that person is deceased. And,
we know who it was.
well,
Deceased.
they think. And they're debating on whether or not to put it out. But, I mean, it's been a long time.
You wrote that. That's in the first book.
Yeah, that story is in the Dark Days book here. Not about them finding it, because this was out before that. So, yes, sir.
Can you tell us any tales from the Salem area book that's coming out, or you don't want to reveal that yet?
Well, I'm writing a story about a police officer who was killed in Salem in 1908.
Charles Miller?
Charles Miller. So that story will be in the books. Yes, sir.
Do you target any specific papers normally, or do you just kind of pick them out at random? And
Newspapers?
Yeah.
Well, because I live in East Liverpool, the public library there has the East Liverpool Review on microfilm. But I also come to Salem sometimes because I try to get as many sources for a story as possible. And if I think that the reporter in the East Liverpool paper wrote a story in a certain way, I also want to know what the reporter in the Salem News wrote, if I think that they would have covered the story. Because sometimes the same person can look at the same thing and pick out different parts. So I cover as many papers as I think I can that will cover the particular story. I've traveled to Youngstown, I've traveled to Wheeling, traveled to Steubenville, you know, anywhere that I think that I can get a source within a reasonable time and Fortunately, the internet is quite helpful as well. There are some newspapers that are online on the internet.
The second question, did you actually go down and walk the grounds there in Hanoverton as far as the supposed murder scene in the grave?
No, because I'm not 100% sure where it is. Oh, and I forgot to tell you one other part of the story. I forgot. You've reminded me. I was at the county archives in Lisbon. And I'm sure some of you folks may be familiar with the county archives. It's a volunteer organization. They got a whole bunch of county records that were going to be thrown away a number of years ago and said, don't throw them away, we'll take them. So they've got these records. Well, fortunately for somebody like myself, they aren't supposed to have been able to get any capital murder cases. But invariably, whoever was cleaning out the basement of the county courthouse, take this, take this.
Yeah.
So they got some murder records. So I can go there and say, do you have anything on this particular thing? So I was there the other day doing a little bit of research about the Miller, this story I just told you. And the one lady there said, well, do you know that house in Hanoverton? There's a house out there on Plymouth Street in Hanoverton that belonged to a doctor by the name of Robertson from the 1840s and 50s. And upstairs, there's a room that you can't get into except through a window.
That's where he did it. That's where they did the autopsy.
And there's rumors that many autopsies were done in this room. And also they hid runaway slaves. And that's the story there. And I added that in there, and I forgot to tell you about that. Whether that's the doctor who was apprenticing the grave robbers, you'll have to decide that for yourself. Yes, ma'am.
Didn't you mention something about gold at the beginning of the story?
Yeah, the gold, I don't know where that came from. They said that was just a complete hoax.
Oh, it didn't?
It did, but it's what started the story. Because it was in David Miller's cabin.
And obviously, if David Miller had that much gold, he wouldn't have hung himself because he could have paid his
He would have paid the debt that he owed, yes.
What about the sisters or whoever was a widow who lived there?
Yes, ma'am.
You know, like how did he get from the fence into the house?
Well,
Somebody had to move them.
I don't think that part of it probably didn't exist. It was a 50-year-old memory by somebody who...
Oh, you don't think he was found in the house?
No.
Oh, okay.
I think that was just part of a 50-year-old memory.
What's your favorite story, Bill, that you've come across?
My favorite story? I wrote a story in Dark Days. I have several favorites because that's how I started the book. When I said I thought I could write one like that, I'd sit down and listed 14 stories that I would like to put in a book because I knew a little bit about or whatever. Some of them were fires, some of them were murders, some of them were other things. Dark Days has 28 chapters, 28 different stories. So 14 other stories I didn't know anything about. I found them researching the 14 original stories. And one of the ones I like the best is about Laura Christie. Laura Christie was a woman who poisoned husbands. She had at least 8 husbands, possibly more, and lived with a couple of other guys, and a number of them ended up dead. Some of them poisoned, and the very last one was a preacher by the name of William Christie, who she poisoned with arsenic, and was arrested and ended up being placed in insane asylum. It's an interesting story, and I have a photograph of Laura Christie, and if you, I didn't bring it with me, but people say to me, "Is that taken after she was dead?" And I said, "No." How she got 8, 9, 10 husbands, I don't know, but she did.
What years were that?
That was in 1923. So, yes.
Have you ever heard or investigated when they say that there are hauntings in the nursing homes in the county?
To be truthful with you, I kind of stay away from ghost stories.
Okay.
That's not where I'm at. So, I know a lot of people are. I've seen enough true life things that I don't think about ghosts. If nothing else, then I thank you for your patience. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
All right.
If you would like to stay and join us for refreshments, we can talk informally afterwards. There's coffee, punch, and cookies. And don't forget, if you might be willing to be a docent, see me. Or if you would like tickets, see any of the board members or people in the gift shop for our banquet in HC. Thank you.
My car's out here. Oh, yeah.